Spring of 1881, half a day's ride west of Plum Creek, Nebraska territory. The sun came late to the plains that morning. What little light did break through the gray hung low and dull like a lantern with soot on the glass. Wind had risen in the night and hadn't calmed since, pushing dust through every crack and seam and shaking the cottonwood trees until they moaned. Will Holt sat with his back against the barn wall, boots planted in the mud. A bloodstain spread slow on the sleeve of his shirt, bright as rust. He hadn't looked at it much. His hand hung limp in his lap. He had not moved it in hours. The horses hadn't been fed. The gate to the south field had blown open sometime in the night, and now the yearlings were scattered, who knew where. He should have gone after them, should have seen to the wound or to the coffee boiling itself black on the stove. Instead, he stared at the fence line where the prairie met sky. There were no people in it. Just the same wind-stretched grass, the same dry hills, and an ache in his chest he hadn't yet found the words for. Behind him, the old house sagged under its own weight. A man could live there alone for years and not remember what his voice sounded like. Will had done just that. Since Callie died and the baby with her, it was as if the house itself had grieved. Floorboards buckled. Shingles peeled away. The front steps had caved in like a mouth refusing to speak. And still he stayed. Sometimes grief sticks to a man like burrs on a coat. It doesn't kill him, but it keeps him from standing too straight. A gust of wind sent a handful of grit across his face. He blinked and wiped his eye with the heel of his good hand, slow. His breath came rough, shallow in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was from the blood loss or something else. He'd taken the bullet late last night. Not in a gunfight like in the old days, but trying to help a neighbor run off a pair of drunks who'd gotten rough with the youngest Lindholm girl. One of them was quick with a pistol, or maybe Will was just slow. He hadn't told anyone. There was no one to tell. A shadow moved at the edge of the field. He squinted through the grit. 2 figures. Children. They were walking straight toward him. Not wandering, not lost. Walking. The older girl was maybe 10, her step stubborn and stiff. The smaller one, hard to tell if it was a boy or girl, followed close behind, holding the older one's coat with both hands. They didn't belong out here. Nobody's kids did. Will tried to stand, but only managed to shift his weight. The pain in his arm roared up and sat him back down hard. The children kept walking. There was something about the way the girl moved, jaw set, eyes forward, like the world had already shown her too much and she'd decided not to flinch anymore. They reached the edge of his yard and stopped. Dust coated their boots. The little one clung tighter to the other's coat. Will looked at them. They looked back. No one spoke. And in that silence, heavier than any storm, something shifted. The girl stepped forward first. She didn't ask permission, didn't offer a name, just moved toward him like it was settled already. The little one stayed a few paces behind, hugging a burlap sack to their chest like it held something precious. Will cleared his throat, though his voice came out dry. "You two lost." The girl shook her head once. "No, sir." It was the kind of voice that didn't come from a child, or shouldn't have. He looked from her to the younger one. "Where's your folks?" The girl's jaw worked, but no words came. Will didn't ask again. Instead, he nodded once, like something had been said between them. He understood all the same. He pushed himself to his feet, slow, using the barn wall to brace his good side. Pain stabbed through his shoulder, white and sudden, but he said nothing. He turned and led them toward the house. Inside, the air was close and heavy with dust and stove smoke. The kitchen bore the quiet wreckage of a man who hadn't expected visitors in years. Dishes in the basin. A coffee pot long boiled dry. The smell of ash and old tobacco. He cleared a space on the table with his elbow, wincing. The girl stood near the doorway, shoulders tight, eyes moving over the room like it might turn on her. The younger one hovered close, clinging to her sleeve now instead of the sack. Will lit the oil lamp. Its flicker threw long shadows across the walls. "You hungry?" he asked. They nodded. He reached into the cupboard and came up with a half loaf of cornbread hard at the edges. Poured some water into tin cups. Set it down in front of them like it meant something. The little one bit into the cornbread like it might disappear. The girl was slower, watching him. He noticed her glancing at the blood on his shirt. "It's not yours," he said. She nodded, cautious. He sat across from them, cradling his arm. "What should I call you?" After a pause, she answered, "Maren." "This is Eli." Will nodded. "You run from somewhere." Walked. He let the silence stretch. She finally spoke. "Our mama's dead. Been 3 days." Her voice didn't shake. Will waited. "Our uncle was supposed to come. He didn't." There was more she wasn't saying. He could see it written all over her in the way she held her body still as fence wire. Will rubbed the stubble on his jaw, the scrape of it sharp under his palm. "Well," he said finally, "you can stay the night. House ain't much, but it's dry." Maren nodded once. He showed them to the room that used to be his wife's sewing room. A cot, a small stove. Dust on the windowsills. He cleared the quilt from the cedar chest and handed it over. "You'll be warm enough," he said. Before closing the door, he paused. "You got any kin worth finding?" Maren looked at him for a long moment. Then shook her head. He shut the door without another word. Back in the kitchen, he poured the last of the whiskey into a chipped glass. The fire crackled low. Outside, the wind had started to die, softening into the kind of quiet that could almost pass for peace. He leaned his head back and listened to the house breathe. Somewhere down the hall, the floor creaked. A small footstep. Then another. It had been a long time since anyone but him had moved through these rooms. And though his arm throbbed and the night pressed heavy, he let his eyes close. Just for a while. The horizon holds more subscribed to see it. Will woke before the sun, as he always did. Pain pulled him back to the surface, his arm hot and stiff beneath the blood-crusted sleeve. He sat up slow, the chill of morning already settled deep in the walls. The wind had calmed, but frost glimmered on the window glass, catching what little light there was. He shrugged on his coat with effort, teeth clenched against the pull in his shoulder, and stepped out into the yard. The horizon was pale and bruised. Somewhere out in the east field a hawk cried, once sharp and far. He found Maren already at the woodpile, struggling to split a log with a dull hatchet near as long as her arm. She didn't flinch when she saw him. Just kept working. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. She struck again, the blade glancing off the wood. Eli sat nearby, legs pulled in tight, watching in silence. The child had said nothing since arriving. Will walked over, took the hatchet from her gently. "Lemme do that." He braced the log with his boot and swung one-handed, awkward but practiced. The wood split on the second try. The sound cracked through the cold like a promise. "You'll ever work a place like this?" he asked, stacking the pieces. Maren shook her head. "We were in town. Mama cleaned rooms at the boarding house." She paused. "I helped." Will nodded. "You'll learn quick enough." He handed her one of the smaller splits. "Start the stove in the kitchen. Eli can help." Maren hesitated, but took the wood and led Eli inside. Will stood a moment longer in the cold, watching the breath rise from the earth. There was a slowness to this place in the morning, a kind of ache that matched the inside of his chest. It hadn't felt like a home in years. Not really. Not since the sickness took Callie and the child she never got to hold. But that girl Maren, with her jaw set like a mule's, and her silence like armor, it was like watching the echo of something he'd lost. By midday, the children had fed the chickens, cleaned the hearth, and hauled water from the pump. Maren worked like someone who knew she had no other choice. Eli stayed close, eyes wide, hands small and quick. Still hadn't spoken a word. That afternoon Will saddled up his old mare and rode out to check the fence line. His shoulder burned with each step, but he didn't turn back. The sky had cleared and the sun warmed the frost to mud. He found 2 posts downed and a stretch of wire slack, probably from a pronghorn passing through. He was hammering in a replacement stake when he heard the sound, small, crunching footsteps behind him. He turned. Eli stood there, coat too big, dragging a coiled rope. Will knelt slower than he used to. "You follow me out here?" Eli nodded. "You're supposed to stay with your sister." Eli looked down. Then, after a long pause, said in a whisper, "You're bleeding again." Will looked. The bandage beneath his coat had soaked through. He cursed under his breath and sat back in the grass. Eli dug in the coat pocket and pulled out a rag. It wasn't clean, but it was something. Will let the child press it to the wound. Small fingers gentle as snowfall. "You ever ride a horse, Ellie?" he asked after a while. Eli shook their head. "Well, maybe tomorrow we'll fix that." The child smiled just barely. Back at the house, Maren was waiting on the porch, arms crossed. She didn't scold, but the worry was all over her face. Will nodded toward Eli. "Came to find me. Brought a rag." Maren looked down at her sibling, then back at Will. "They don't usually talk." "Spoke just fine today." Maren's eyes softened just a little. "Must trust you." Will didn't know what to say to that. That night the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table. Will cut slices of salt pork and spooned beans from the pot. Maren asked if she could wash the blood from his shirt. He nodded. "Hang it by the stove. Should dry by morning." No one said much else. But when the wind rose again and the lamps flickered low, the house didn't feel quite so hollow. Will watched the children lean against each other, half asleep, and felt something settle inside him. Not peace, exactly, but weight. Meaning, like maybe he wasn't just bleeding out in a house full of ghosts. Maybe something new had begun. The days passed the way they always had on the plains, slow, sharp-edged, and full of small work. Fixing fences, tending animals, hauling water from the pump that froze over most mornings. But something had shifted in Will's world, quiet and steady, like the way winter melts without anyone seeing it happen. Maren rose each morning before dawn without being told. She moved through chores like she'd always known how, like the land itself had taught her. Will showed her how to milk the goat, how to spot a fence post gone soft with rot, how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the birds flew low. She listened without interrupting, took it all in like it might save her. Eli stayed closer to the house, but each day wandered farther. They followed chickens like a shadow, built little stick fences around patches of grass, watched Will closely when he sharpened tools. Still quiet most of the time, but more present now, less folded into themselves. Will taught Eli how to sit a horse one cold morning, wrapping a thick wool blanket around them both. They rode the perimeter at a walk, his good hand on the reins, the other braced around the child's chest. The horse's breath steamed in the air. Eli didn't speak, but when they dismounted, their face held something close to joy. That night, as Maren swept ashes from the stove and Will wrapped fresh cloth around his healing arm, she said without looking up, "We can stay for a while." "Right." He paused. "You can stay as long as you want." She nodded once, but her shoulders dropped a little, like something heavy had been let go. They didn't talk about the past much, and Will didn't press. But sometimes late at night he'd hear Maren crying, quiet and stubborn under her breath, and he'd sit awake in his bed until the sound stopped. Grief didn't come all at once. It crept in like snow under a door, one drift at a time. Weeks turned to a month. The prairie began to soften underfoot. Sap rose in the trees. Calves were born, scrawny and shaking but alive. The old windmill that hadn't turned in years creaked once, then spun slow in the breeze. One afternoon Will came back from town with sugar flour and a bundle of cloth Marin had asked for. He also brought a letter. He held it out at the table that night, unfolded and smoothed on the wood. His name was written on the outside, but the words inside were not for him alone. "Sheriff found your uncle," he said. "Didn't want to, but I asked." Marin's face went still. "He's in Dodge. Been there a while. Not looking for anyone." Marin's jaw worked once, but she said nothing. Will looked at her, then down at his hands. "He don't want you." "I know," she said, voice hard. They sat like that for a long while. Eli reached across the table, touched Marin's sleeve. Will leaned back in his chair. "You still got a choice, though." "What choice?" she asked, bitter. "We're nothing out here." Will shook his head. "You're not nothing. You're here. And that means something." She looked up at him, then really looked, and something passed between them. Not affection, not yet, but recognition, a quiet agreement. He was not her father. She was not his child. But they belonged to something now. Maybe not by blood. Maybe by something older. Will stood and opened the small drawer in the hutch. From it he pulled a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. He slid it across the table to her. "What's this?" "Land deed. This place is paid for. Been in my name a long while. Could be in more than mine if that's what you want." She stared at the paper like it might burn her fingers. Eli whispered we could stay. Will nodded. "If you want it?" Marin reached out, hand trembling just slightly, and touched the corner of the deed. It was not forgiveness. It was not a miracle, but it was something to hold on to. That night the fire in the hearth burned strong. The house no longer felt like it might fall in on itself. Outside snow began to fall again, but soft this time. Quiet. Like a beginning. The storm that rolled in that night wasn't hard, just steady. Snow drifted down in slow silence, covering the plains in a soft white coat by morning. The kind that blanketed the world without fury, just quiet and weight. Will shoveled the walk shoulder tight and burning again, but he worked through it. Marin hauled wood without being asked, boots crunching across the yard. Eli built a snow creature by the porch, 2 rocks for eyes, a crooked stick for a mouth. By noon the sky had gone clean and blue. Smoke curled from the chimney. The world outside looked almost gentle. They were sitting down to eat, Will cutting through a slice of dried venison, Marin spooning stew into Eli's bowl, when the dog came. It was mutt-bred ribs, showing limping through the snow. It staggered into the yard like it had been walking for days. Eli spotted it first and stood up quick, knocking the stool over. Will rose too, unsure. Animals didn't usually come that close. Not unless they were starving. He stepped outside with caution. The dog stopped at the edge of the yard and looked up at him with pale yellow eyes. Then it lay down, not from trust but from exhaustion. Will crouched near it, reaching slow. The dog didn't move. Marin stepped out behind him, holding a chunk of leftover bread. "It's not wild," she said. Will nodded. "No. Someone owned it." She knelt too, offering the bread. The dog took it, gentle, barely chewing. Will scanned the horizon. No tracks but the dog's. "Maybe it ran off," Marin offered. "Or got left." Will didn't answer. That night the dog slept curled beside the stove. Eli named it Scout and sat up late whispering to it like a secret. Will let them. He didn't say much, but he kept glancing at the door. 3 days later a rider came. Will saw the dust first. A single figure, distant and slow, coming in from the south trail. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, not raising it, just resting the weight. The rider dismounted stiffly. He was thin, pale under a week's worth of dust. A hat pulled low. His horse looked worse than he did. Will stepped down into the yard. "Can I help you?" The man didn't answer right away, just looked past Will toward the house. Then, looking for a couple of kids. "Took off weeks back. Town marshal said someone seen them out this way." Will felt something go cold and tight in his chest. "Girl named Marin," the man said. "Her and her brother belong to me." Will didn't move. "You their uncle?" "By law, yeah. Law doesn't always mean much." The man's eyes narrowed. "You saying you got them?" Will's hand tightened around the rifle stock. "I'm saying they're here, and they ain't going back with you." The man's mouth pulled sideways. "You don't get to say that." Marin appeared in the doorway, then Eli behind her, clutching the dog. She didn't speak, but she didn't back down either. Just stood there, face still as ice. The man stepped forward. "You don't belong here, girl." Marin raised her chin. "We do now." He looked at Will. "You're harboring runaways. I could take this to court." "You could," Will said. "But you'd have to make it back to town first." The silence stretched, long enough for the wind to whistle once between them. Finally the man looked away, spat in the snow. "Ain't worth it. They're nothing but mouths to feed anyhow." He turned, climbed back into the saddle, and rode off without another word. Will watched until the dust settled again, until the plains went still. Then he turned to Marin. "You all right?" She nodded, but she was shaking. That night they sat around the stove Scout, asleep between Eli's feet. Will sipped coffee with both hands, warmth seeping into his bones. "He won't come back," Marin said, not asking. "No," Will replied. "And if he does, he won't find what he's looking for." "What are we then?" she asked. Will didn't answer right away. Then he looked at her and said quiet and plain, "We're a family. If you want to be." Marin didn't speak, but she leaned her shoulder against his just for a second. And that said enough. The days that followed came brighter. The wind still cut through the valley and snow still lined the gullies, but something had softened in the silence between them all. Marin spoke more now, small things, mostly about chores, the land, the things Eli said in sleep. But it was steady, and that mattered more than the words themselves. Will kept them busy. Spring was pushing in, and the work came with it. Fence lines needed mending from the thaw. A chicken hawk had taken one of the hens. The goat was nearing birthing and needed watch. He showed Marin how to read signs in her swollen belly, and the girl took to it quick, like the knowledge had been waiting in her all along. They fixed the porch together one afternoon. Will steadied the boards while Marin hammered her sleeves, rolled up hair tied back with a rag. Sawdust clung to her shirt, and when she laughed just once when Scout knocked over the water bucket, Will looked up fast, startled by the sound. It had been so long since anyone had laughed in this place. Later, while they rested, Eli brought over a drawing scratched in charcoal on feed sack paper, a house, a horse, a stick figure with a rifle, two smaller ones beside it. Will stared at it for a long time. "That me?" he asked. Eli nodded. Will smiled, one side of his mouth curling just barely. "You made me too tall." Eli giggled, which was rare enough to make Marin look up. That night, as the sun lowered behind the far hills and the sky bled gold and lavender, Will sat on the porch with a mug of chicory coffee and a wool blanket across his knees. The kids were inside laughing soft over something he couldn't hear. Scout barked once and settled by the door. He watched the light stretch across the field, warming everything it touched. There'd been years when this porch faced nothing but wind and ghosts. But now it opened onto something else. He didn't name it, just sat with it. Marin came out after a while, arms folded. She sat beside him without speaking for a minute. "I fixed the window in the barn," she said, "and the latch on the grain bin." He nodded. "You did good. I like doing it. You're good at it." They sat a while longer. Will, she said, quieter now, did you ever want kids? He looked down at his hands, weathered and still marked with scars that never quite faded. We tried, he said. Callie and me. The one we had didn't make it. After that, no more came. Maren said nothing, just leaned her shoulder to his again. Would liked a girl like you, he added. She nodded, didn't cry. Just stayed there beside him while the stars started to show. That spring they built a chicken run together, added another goat to the pen. Will went into town and came back with a bundle of school books, used and dog-eared but clean. Maren sorted them one by one on the kitchen table while Ely turned the pages pretending to read. A few weeks later, the Lindholms came by, the same neighbors from months before, the ones whose girl Will had stepped in to protect. They brought jam and seed packets, asked questions. Maren answered most of them. By summer, folks in town knew about the children, knew they stayed. Will let them think what they wanted. Nobody tried to take them. Nobody came asking again. They weren't blood, but they were his. And when the garden came up strong and the goat dropped twins in the barn, and Ely took their first solo ride on the old mare, without falling once, Will stood in the yard, hands on his hips, and looked around. The prairie was still cruel, still lonesome, still wide enough to swallow a man whole if he let it. But now it held something steady. Now it held them. The days stretched long and full with the summer sun. The land, once hard and quiet, seemed to hum with life. Corn grew in rows out back, rough and green. Wildflowers sprung up in patches along the fence lines, and Ely brought them in by the handful, stuffing them in chipped jars to place on windowsills. Even the wind felt gentler. The house, too, changed. It no longer groaned like it wanted to fall in on itself. Maren had patched the roof with Will, and they had whitewashed the porch posts together. Ely painted the shutters blue with an old brush tongue stuck out the side of their mouth in focus. Scout followed close wherever they went, half watchdog, half shadow. One evening Will came in late from the field with a splinter the size of a nail in his palm. Maren sat him down, cleaned it without a word. He hissed once, but didn't pull away. She wrapped the hand with care and tied the knot slow. After he looked at her, "You could be a doctor." She gave a faint smile. "Maybe I will be." "You can. Whatever you set your mind to." She didn't answer, but she held his gaze, and something in her eyes flickered warm. That night they sat on the front steps with plates on their laps, the sky fading soft around them. Will passed the pan of beans, and Ely reached for seconds. The air smelled like dirt and wood smoke and a little bit like hope. It was Maren who spoke first. "I remember the day Mama died," she said, voice even not asking for pity. She was coughing blood. Couldn't sit up. I tried to go get help, but Uncle said she wasn't worth the trouble. Ely looked down. Scout leaned close. "I sat with her. I told her I'd look after Ely." She nodded, but she couldn't talk by then. Will listened without speaking. "I buried her with a spoon," Maren went on, "because I couldn't carry the shovel. She was light, but I was small." Will reached over slow and steady, placed his good hand on her shoulder. "Not hard. Just enough. She'd be proud," he said. Maren nodded, eyes wet, but not falling. "I know." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain in the distance. A week later the schoolhouse reopened in town after repairs. The teacher, Miss Hanley, rode out herself to speak with Will. "They'd be welcome," she said, nodding toward Ely and Maren. "We're short on older students, and it's no trouble." Will looked to Maren, who hesitated. She glanced down at Ely, who was pretending not to listen. "We could try," she said at last. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Will said. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." They started school the next week. Will hitched the wagon each morning and rode them halfway, then watched as they walked the rest along the dusty road, shoulders side by side. He missed them when they were gone, not in a loud way, just in the quiet that returned when the house stood still too long. He filled the hours with work, but some afternoons he found himself whittling something out of scrap wood, small toys, picture frames, a new latch for Eli's box of treasures. The days ran on. Harvest would come soon. Marin brought home books from the library and sat reading aloud to Eli by lamplight. Will sometimes listen from the doorway, eyes closed, letting her voice carry him somewhere better. Then one clear evening, as the last light hit the far hills, Eli ran out to the porch holding the box of drawings. They laid them all out, pictures of horses and cabins, sunrises and snow and people. 3 of them. Again and again. Will looked down at the last one. A house, a sun overhead, and a name scribbled underneath. Holt Place. He looked at Eli, then at Marin standing behind them, arms crossed but smiling. He picked up the drawing and folded it once, carefully tucking it into his pocket like something sacred. This place, once a hollow shell of grief, had become something else. Not a legend. Not yet. But something real. Something worth keeping. Autumn came on slow, with gold in the trees and a hush in the air that meant the land was holding its breath. Will felt it in his bones, that old ache that warned winter wasn't far off. The mornings were colder now, the nights longer. Smoke curled thicker from the chimney and the goats' coats grew dense. He found Marin in the barn one morning, mending an old saddle with careful stitches. "You ever ride far?" he asked her. "Not far," she said. "Just away." Will nodded. "That's good enough." He watched her a moment, how steady her hands were, how sure she'd become. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked without looking up. "I did once," he said. "After Callie passed, I thought about just going. Didn't know where." "Why didn't you?" He shrugged. "Something in me said stay, even if it didn't make sense. Thought maybe I owed her that. To hold on." Marin tied off the stitch, sat back. "I think maybe you were waiting for us." Will looked at her, not with surprise, just quiet understanding. "Maybe I was." Whoa. That night after supper, the 3 of them sat around the table, Scout curled beneath Eli's feet. Will reached into the cabinet and brought out a small box worn with age. He set it in the center of the table. "I want you both to see something." He opened the lid. Inside were pieces of his life, an old photograph of Callie, her hair pinned back, eyes soft, a locket that had belonged to her mother, a bullet flattened flat against time, and a folded letter yellowed and frayed. Marin picked up the photo. She was beautiful. "She was everything good in me," Will said. "Taught me how to hold still, how to listen." He tapped the bullet. "That one came awful close. Years back. Thought I was done for. After that I told her I'd stop riding with the posse. She just said good, like she knew all along." Eli touched the locket gently. "She wanted a family here. We tried, but it wasn't in the cards. For a long time I thought maybe that meant I was meant to be alone." He looked at them both now. "Turns out I was just waiting for the right ones." Marin's hand closed around the photograph. She didn't speak. Will stood slow from the ache in his hip and reached into his coat. Pulled out another piece of paper, newer, clean, ink still fresh. He set it down in front of Marin. "What is it?" she asked. "Name transfer," he said. "For the land. For the house. I'm putting it in all 3 of ours." Marin stared at the paper. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." The wind rattled the windows softly. "You don't owe us anything," she said. "I don't," he agreed. "But I've never had anything I wanted to leave behind before. Now I do." Eli looked up wide-eyed. "So it's ours forever?" Will nodded. "Yours to grow." To keep. To pass on if that's what you want someday. Maren swallowed. Her eyes were wet again, but her voice was steady. We'll take care of it. I know, he said. That night Will stood on the porch long after they'd gone to bed. The sky was full of stars. Scout sat beside him, ears twitching at every sound. He thought of the years behind him of dust and blood, and the way loss could hollow a man out until there was nothing left but skin and silence. But this felt like something planted deep, something that might grow. Maybe this was what Callie had meant. Maybe this was what she'd been waiting for too. Inside, the lamp still burned in the front window, a soft glow against the dark, a signal to anyone still out there that the house was lived in, claimed, loved. Will took off his hat and pressed it to his chest. Thank you, he whispered to the night. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. If the fire warmed you, subscribe and stay near.